All right. So I want to welcome everybody to the Cornerstone of America podcast, episode 30. And I am honored actually to be joined by Jonathan. And forgive me if I mess up your last name, Jakubowski. Did I say it right?
You got it, man. That's great.
Sweet. Yeah. Jonathan is the director of SmartSolve, an award-winning startup business focused on sustainable packaging. I actually looked at that website, man. That's pretty interesting. A lot of water-soluble technology with like packing materials and whatnot. And Jonathan received his undergraduate degree from Bowling Green State University and a master's degree in public policy from Georgetown University. I actually had a question about that too. Don't let me forget when we get started. And he's an avid social entrepreneur and founder of Champions in Action, and is a chairman of the Forge Leadership Network Board of Directors. In 2017, Jonathan was unanimously selected as executive committee chairman of the Wood County Republican Party and sits on the Wood County Board of Elections. Jonathan, I read your intro and I feel like a slug. Just accomplishments, man. So actually, I had a question because I wanted to get into this before we got going with your book, and this is really interesting to me because this was like a life choice, right? Like a big kind of a fork in the road moment for you. You wrote in your book when you were just starting to pursue your master's at Georgetown, you had an opportunity, like a pretty big, opportunity to take an interview for a position that you probably had a good, like an inside shot to get. Can you tell everybody about that and then the decision you decided to go with?
Sure. So the story goes, I ended up in DC. I was living in Houston, and my now wife was my fiance. We were planning on living in Houston. And then I read an article about a guy named Tony Hall. He was a former member of Congress, a Democrat leader who was working in food aid. And I read his story and said, kind of like what you just said, but I feel like I'm slacking. Like I'm not doing things in life that matter that much. And by the way, that's not true at all about yourself. You have a pretty amazing resume and background there. I've been able to read through it.
Thank you.
But Tony Hall was an inspiration to me. So I told that to my fiance. Her name's Missy. And she said, man, maybe we should consider differently. Rather than moving to Houston, maybe we should look at coming to DC. So that started the wheels turning. And then she talked to her landlord, who said, you're not going to believe this, but Tony Hall lives on our block. I said, what? Are you kidding me? So the very place that she lived is where Tony Hall lived. We, ironically, after we got married, we did move to DC. Make a long story short, ended up choosing to go to graduate school at Georgetown. And we were on the same block. So still connected to the Hall residence. He was never home. I mean, very, very rarely would I see him. But I ended up being offered the opportunity to become his assistant. I was about 6 months into graduate school, and that was a pretty amazing opportunity. But one of the things that I have grown up with and learned throughout life is that once you make a commitment, you want to finish it through. So both Missy and I felt like it was important to complete the graduate degree at Georgetown and finish those 2 years.
See, that's pretty interesting, and it's probably like one of the hardest things to do because you're what at that time in your like early mid-20s, something like that, right? Hey,
yeah, this is Sammy. Sammy's my 5-year-old. I have 4 kids, and Sammy just had a birthday in February, so he just had a late present because of the COVID restrictions. We weren't able to celebrate with family.
Hey, Sammy,
there's the toy you got.
That's very cool. That's awesome. He turned 5.
He turned 5 years old.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, we might have a couple more interruptions. I'm not sure. Why don't you go see Mama? Because she was waiting for you downstairs to show you a movie. I hope your audience doesn't mind that at all.
No, dude, not at all. Not at all.
Life,
if you've gotten even listened to a couple of my podcasts, I mean, this isn't CNN, man. This is this is fun. That's actually one of the things I love about podcasting is it's your own thing. Nobody telling you what to do, and kind of go with it and have some fun. I mean, getting into, we'll get into that as well as far as the kids part. But the reason why that kind of stood out to me, especially at the beginning of your book, is you were in your early mid-20s at that time?
Yeah, mid-20s.
Yeah. So making it a hard decision like that, which is you're putting off something that would be like immediately gratifying, right? Like especially if you got that position and it's a big opportunity, but it potentially could sacrifice some long-term success with, your master's degree in that program that you had already committed to. And it wasn't like you had enrolled in that and you hadn't started yet. Like you said, you were already 6 months into that program, right? And taking on that role, especially, even though it's a pretty amazing opportunity, but and role as an assistant, you don't really control your schedule. You're going to be all over the place, and you're probably going to really put the ability to have any time and commitment towards your degree, on, like, it becomes kind of secondary, to what
Right.
you're committing to in that job. So
Hmm.
knowing when to, like, go after things is really important, but at the same time, knowing when to say no is really, really, it's a skill that you really need to build up, and being able to do that at a young age, man. That's like, I commend you on that. That's tough. There's a lot of times I'll look back on my life going like, why didn't I just say no to that? That was stupid.
Right. Right. It's
Yeah.
not easy. I think I've heard it said this way, that life presents thousands of opportunities, but every time you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to 1,000 others. So we got to be really careful to say yes to the right opportunities. And then the owner of my company, and the mentor of mine, very close friend as well, he says that there's opportunities and there's assignments.
Mm-hmm.
Choose assignments.
Interesting. That's an interesting way of looking at it, especially with the like saying yes to one thing, and then how it will more than likely close off a lot of doors to other things as well. So you're committing to a lot of things. That's really interesting, man. I like the way you look at that. So, and then obviously we met one of your kids. You got 4 kids, you said?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
have 4. Amelia, who is the oldest, we were expecting her during the last 6 months of graduation at Georgetown, and that was a pretty big decision for my wife and I, whether or not we were going to raise a family in the DC area where I
Mm-hmm.
had job opportunities, or we were going to return home where we're both from, which is Northwest Ohio. Obviously, we chose the latter, as we live now in Wood County, and have, since we had Amelia in 2010, we have now had 3 others to follow.
Oh man, that's awesome. And that's another, a time in your life where you had to make this decision, where you had a lot of, after you finished graduate school, you had a lot of opportunities, and you talked about that in your book as well. And you made the decision to go back to Ohio. Like, what was the big deciding factor in that to go back home and not, keep pursuing things in DC?
It's a great question, and we've analyzed it and reanalyzed it over and over again. And I think in the first couple of years back in Bowling Green, in a startup environment where things were really struggling and things weren't going the way we expected to, we asked ourselves the question, did we make the wrong decision? But here, years since, looking back upon that decision, we really believe it was the right decision, because it was based in prayer, and it was based upon the conviction that you can't replace family.
Mhm.
They're saying there's no place like home. Our extended family was here, so our ability to raise our kids in an environment where there were family members that cared about them and loved them had a difference in their lives. So it was the right decision to make.
Yeah, and I can imagine being from Ohio, right, and then DC. So we're just talking just like geography, right? So Ohio, you've got a lot of places. It's open, and depending on what part of the state you're in, but still, you've got a lot more areas where DC is just packed. I mean, just tight, built on top of each other, and
Mm-hmm.
we just had friends that had moved out here from New York, like a month before the whole shutdown, right? Literally about a month before, and they had their first child, and I asked them, like, what's the difference between being, and here meaning I'm up in Tacoma, Washington, down here in the Pacific
Mm-hmm.
Northwest, and I asked them what's the difference, and they said couldn't imagine raising a child. And not to knock anybody who's doing it, but just from somebody who's from a state that has more open area, open land, room to roam and move around, being in these tight confined spaces like a DC or a New York, Manhattan, that kind of thing as well. So I'm wondering if that played a little bit into it as well too.
There's definitely challenges and opportunities that are associated with living in big cities. And one of the benefits of being in graduate school in DC, studying political science, essentially was that we had access to all of these leaders who
Right.
presentations, brown bag presentations. We have, the former secretaries of state coming in and talking to us. And I look back at that and then thought about the benefits our kids could have had in that kind of tight environment, maybe meeting those people. So there certainly were opportunities, and there was an opportunity cost that should be acknowledged and was acknowledged. But the benefits of being able to raise kids in a community where your family is, and where the complexity of navigating a 2-work schedule, or the complexity of not having family around to watch the kids if you have some event, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe not having people around them that have the same belief systems that you do. Those challenges to us were the reason why we really felt like the decision to move back home was the best decision.
Oh, that's interesting. one of the things I wanted to ask you about was when you start off in your book, you go into the first few chapters, you give a lot of information, a lot of data, and a lot of analytics into voting and swing states and demographics and everything like that too. Was that something that was like, as you were kind of diving into that when you were doing the research, was that interesting to you, or was that almost like, okay, I have to trudge through all this? Because you know how some things become naturally to other people,
Yeah.
as far as numbers. Like my wife, statistics, she's like a statistics nerd. She loves that stuff, right? And I'm more of like, let me learn this way. Like, let me talk to people and figure it out, right?
For sure.
Yeah. So the process of writing is always interesting, especially the more authors I talk to. How was that whole process for you? How long did it take you to put the book together?
So to answer the first question, honestly, that's probably one of the things I'm most nervous about. I'm a first-time author, so there's a lot I don't know. You just don't know what you don't know. And that chapter specifically, chapter 2, is one that I labored over quite a bit. And I do present as much data as possible because I want the arguments that are made in the book to have substantiated data to back them. And the claim I'm making in this book is that Wood County, the county that I live in, is a swing county. And I have a lot of data to support it being a swing county, one of 56 of 3,142. So I actually enjoyed the deep data dive. I enjoyed the data crunching, going precinct by precinct, spending hours assessing and understanding and analyzing our county. Since I am involved in the Republican Party here in Wood County, that means it had a tangential benefit by allowing me to have a better grasp on local elections here. But for the sake of the book, I really enjoyed it. My concern was, am I going so deep that I'm going to lose the reader almost right out of the gate? So I would love to hear what you thought about chapter 2, since you're not necessarily a statistics and data guy.
Well, I actually liked it because I actually enjoy learning about the statistics and the number stuff itself. Specifically, it was really interesting to see as you kind of started like delving deep into the history of like the voting history there and the demographics and getting into specific numbers. Because the one thing, like, I mean, you were kind of texting back and forth a little bit before we, as we were kind of setting up this interview, is, and this has nothing to do specifically with which way anybody leans politically. I'm talking about just generally having like an actual open conversation based on like facts and intellect, right? Is so many people get caught up with talking about, like, they argue through feelings, right? And then you even talked about that in your book as well, where they're tied to an ideology, right? But there's no, and then they'll seek out information to match up with the ideology versus actually looking for facts, right? And actual information. So having a conversation sometimes where, it's good to be like, have feelings and be passionate about something, but at the same time, when you're so passionate and so far gone where you're removed any level of just foresight and and deep thought into anything that you're saying, it's kind of hard to have an intellectual conversation with anybody. And then of course people, you get these trigger words people get, or subjects that people get into, and then that makes it difficult as well. So one of the things we were talking about was having a conversation. Instead of just going back and forth with somebody, I just kept asking why. Like, okay, why do you think this? Why? Where did you get that information? How did you come across this opinion? And the deeper you dig, kind of like you did with your book with the numbers and stuff, a lot of times you realize people, they're not that deep with their, with the knowledge, the depth of knowledge for what they actually, hold on to, as far as like, this is where I planted my flag on this hill. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we see it all the time. And at the end of the book, after we go through the 7 stories of the millennials who had that transformation of soul, I get into a critique of conservative methods of persuasion. And the argument I make is primarily, one, Benjamin Franklin says this at the Constitutional Convention. He says that every man ought to doubt a little bit of himself. Like, we don't always have the full truth and nothing but the truth. We need to have the humility to recognize that we can always learn from somebody else. I don't care who that person is. I don't care what worldview they have. We can always learn something from somebody else. So my first prescription to conservatives who hope to affect the minds and hearts of the millennial generation is to first become a very good listener. If you can become a really good listener, you can hear their story out. You can hear things that you might be able to learn from, as well as learn where they might be, to your point, they might have a faltered view, or a view that lacks data, or an emotional view tied to something that's not truth.
Right, and that's the one thing that, and I don't know if this falls into millennials or just any age group, is when somebody is, I think it falls more into like outrage culture in general, is they do lack the ability to listen, actually hear what somebody is saying versus just
Right.
shout somebody down, which is gets to the other point, which is you made that point in your book as well, where you've gone so far to one side that you've completely gotten away from the origins of that party or that political party per se, and where the core tenet values is freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the Second Amendment. I mean, just going on to the constitutional, like, foundational values of this country, right?
Yeah, I think the First Amendment is in danger. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. That's it. That's the First Amendment right there. And it's such a staple of American society, and was a huge part of the reason it's the First Amendment is because the Anti-Federalists recognized that the Constitution seemed to lack this specific provision that they believed needed to be outlined in case there would come a day when people would view speech as violence, in case there came a day when government would decide to oppress and suppress those who had an opinion that differed from them. So that First Amendment is something that's foundational to who we are as Americans. It's one of the things that we plant our flag on, the hill of freedom, with the First Amendment as the thing that we stand behind and stand for. So it's critical that younger minds and younger leaders have the ability to embrace that and to recognize that even if you disagree with somebody, that doesn't mean they should be shut down. They shouldn't be name called. They shouldn't be screamed at. Take a moment to listen to them. They might have something that can help you improve your life.
Right, and I think that gets to the other part too, which is you have the freedom to say what you want, and to an extent to express your feelings and your thoughts and everything else as well on multiple platforms. But I think that also gets to the other end where people forget that freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom of consequence, right? Like, as far as like having an understanding that when you do say something and you put it out on a platform, there is going to be and when I say consequence, people take the word consequence like to have like a negative connotation, right? Like, no, it's just a something that comes out of like an action that you do, right? Like, I talk to my kids about that. And if you're going to put an idea out there or a thought or anything else of that nature, like out there, then you need to understand that there's going to be some type of repercussions, both pro and con to what you're doing as well. Attention, everything else as well too. So, and
good point. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
What you're doing on this podcast, you're exposing your perspective and views, and you're likely to receive criticism.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody that decides to go public with what they have or what they believe is going to face some level of criticism, but criticism should not be the measure that defines our actions. Our
Right.
actions should be defined by core convictions.
Yep. I couldn't have said it better. So speaking of like going public, right? You've chosen to take your career path into a level of politics, but not directly, at least not yet, into actual political office, right? So you're involved in politics. So how do you? I got two questions here. One is being involved in politics in the way you are with what you do, both like in, private enterprise and also with the public sector, some of the things that you do and the board you sit on. How do you balance that with family life? And what I mean by that is the public, especially now that you have a book out, right? The public criticism and backlash that could come with that as well. And then of course, where do you find that balance of like keeping your family separate from, what you want to do as well? Or is it just all together and you guys are all together going forward? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I wouldn't be honest with you and the audience if I didn't cite that as a potential concern. There's a lot of crazy people out there who, to our conversation a moment ago, probably feel like they should harm somebody that disagrees with them. And I've happened to take a formal role in a party that a lot of younger individuals disagree with, and very passionate individuals seek to go against. In fact, in my book, I talk about a story in the post office where there's a young man in his early 20s who is inspired by the likes of Hillary Clinton and Maxine Waters, who start talking about hitting them below the knees and fighting fire with fire. And that kid decides that he wasn't doing enough. So he ends up taking on himself the burden of finding a way to fight these bigoted, racist Republicans. Finds himself in a post office, and there he sees thousands of slate cards. Slate cards are these cards that we'll send out before elections. And I represent a county party. So I'm talking about the commissioner the treasurer. Most people don't even know who their names are, much less what party they represent. But he sees the word Republican on it and decides that it's his duty to destroy these things. So he starts destroying these things by the handful. And the story is in the book, so maybe people can read it later. But the bottom line is the actions that he took followed the idea that you needed to do something aggressively against a belief system. And that's where I look at that and consider that, and then make sure that with my wife, we're in tune about how we are going to protect our family, how we're going to handle criticism, the things that we want to stand for. And if there's disagreement about an event, or if there's dissonance, or if there's concern, we navigate that carefully.
Oh, it's interesting. Yeah. I know for myself, just like as I started kind of getting through this, into this podcast more and more and talking to more individuals, and again, I'm pretty self-aware, and I have a extensive background on security as well. And, but one thing I didn't really kind of take into consideration as much is after an episode would release, I would get random comments, through social media, friends, former friends, friends on Facebook,
Right.
people I haven't talked to in years, and I was happy they listened to that episode, but gleaning, bits of a conversation is, and then throwing this random, criticism at you, for the most part, it was like, at first you get a little defensive. It's like, well, no, that's not what I meant. That's not what I was there for. But then you kind of realize, like, okay, this is what, all the podcasts and stuff I listen to all the time, this is what they're talking about, and it's not about like ignoring everything and not listening to any kind of critique whatsoever, but it's more of like, you have to have some level of a filter, right? Like you can't keep going down that rabbit hole of like comments on a broadcast, or every critique that comes your way too. But at the same time, sure. Yeah, but at the same time, you do need to be aware of actual levels of, potential risk or anything like that too with the family itself. So is there a reason why you focus more on, I guess you would call it the operational side of politics versus actually being out front, like running for office? Or is that something potentially down the road you're thinking of doing?
It's a great question. It was more that the opportunity presented itself than I was pursuing it. So leaving Georgetown, I was very much questioning my political allegiance. I had grown up in a home where my parents voted Republican and kind of followed that line of logic. But as I went to class at Georgetown with all of these students, about 99.9% of whom were Democrats, liberals, progressives, and they were very persuasive in their arguments. What they said made a lot of sense. And, as a Christian, I had, and I've traveled to a number of countries and have learned a lot about apologetics. I understand and understood back then why I believed what I believed. So I could have a conversation with somebody and really hold my own in any context. But when it came to these political beliefs or political convictions, I realized pretty quickly that I couldn't hold a match to the arguments they were making. So I grew disillusioned with that philosophy, and when upon returning home to Ohio, started to say, before I do anything with politics, I really need to spend time understanding the foundations of our story as Americans. What are the foundations of these parties? What do they represent? And does it align with truth? Because that was the thing that I most yearned for, was truth. And I spent about 5 years quietly in the background, reading, studying, learning, memorizing, gaining information. And then at the end of that 5-year period, it just so happened that there was a race here in Bowling Green, Ohio, between a far left candidate for mayor and our mayor, who's just a nice guy in his 70s who had done a lot of good stuff for the city, but was pretty much an independent. He wore an R, but he was really independent in the way that he governed. And they desperately needed help because they were 4 weeks from election day, and they had not used any digital platforms whatsoever.
Oh, okay.
The message of his media, whereas the other candidate was spending like crazy and doing a great job getting his brand out there. So being a millennial and having a little bit of tech savviness, I was able to do a few small things and get some videos out there with the support of my company. And we got 20,000 views on some of his videos pretty quickly, and he ended up winning the race. So as a result of that, the local political party, the county political party, was having a transition of leadership, and they said, we need that kind of talent to win in the future. Like, we're too antiquated, too outdated. We need to take that kind of idea and those strategies and bring them forward. And they then offered me the position to be chairman of the party. And originally I said no. My wife and I said, there's no way. We're going to start a business. I have a nonprofit that we've launched that's growing and moving forward, growing family. There's just no way we can do this. So once I said no, I went back to, I mentioned my boss earlier, his name's Al Caperna. He owns the company. I said, hey, Al, here's this unique opportunity that I've been offered. Maybe you or somebody else can take it. And he looked at me and said, no, John, I actually think as a company, we want to become more invested in ways we can support the community. And the mission statement at the CMC Group, which is the holding companies, the holding company for all of the smaller companies, says they are to exist to birth, grow, and operate businesses to model and extend the kingdom of God. He takes that mission statement and says, I believe this is a mission statement that calls us to be engaged when we have opportunity to make the lives of people better. I want you to take it. I'm going to resource you for it. So that was 2016, and that has been the case. I became chairman officially in 2017.
That's amazing, because how many times have you heard stories about somebody presenting something to their superior higher up in a company that's not only going to benefit the individual themselves, but potentially benefit the company as well, and immediately just gets shot down, right? Like there's no visionary whatsoever. And I think that's that gets to my next question with working within the Republican Party with what you're doing right now. Is, do you find that with the benefits of the party itself, that at least the core tenets of it, of holding on to the Constitution and the core values of America, do you find that also it's hard to kind of bring at least what you're trying to do within the party, bring it to the 21st century, as far as bringing, utilizing social media, utilizing maybe some different ways of kind of looking at things, and different views as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, in the introduction to the book, I talk a little bit about how I believe Republicans, conservatives have gained some ground. I think 10 years ago, they were way behind the times. I mean, you look at the 2008 and 2012 campaigns
Right.
that Obama had, and you look at his machine and the effectiveness of it versus the political machines of his opponents, Romney and McCain. And I would say that the party was super outdated, but it has since gained tremendous ground. But it's one thing to be effective at communicating. It's another thing to have a message. And my caution to conservatives is, if you're going to adopt the machine and the innovation, that's fantastic. That will help you win. But don't adopt the strategy and the process. Don't adopt the concept of you read the likes of books that talk about fighting fire with fire, and really using this is the be all end all of everything. Is, I think, the leftist view of government. Don't adopt that philosophy. Hold true to the values that the Republican Party was founded upon in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin, when we fought slavery. Those are the things that we should stand for and believe in, with a new vehicle of innovation and technology.
Isn't that interesting how the narrative got switched around so much with, like, when you bring up slavery? How I still, to me, it amazes me that the Democratic Party positioned itself as the party for minorities. But if you look at the history of the parties themselves and how the Republican Party was founded, and again, for everybody listening, 2008 was I was getting ready to open my first gym. I was in my late 20s, and political leanings, I didn't really have any political leanings at all whatsoever myself. And I just remember, and the reason why this kind of really kind of resonates with me is what you just said about how the party was utilizing tactics and social media and technology, which was, so when Obama won the nomination in 2008, and it was going back and forth between, McCain had won it for the Republicans, and then it was going back and forth between Obama and Hillary, right? And I was in my gym at the time, and I was talking to a couple clients, and this is in the heart of Silicon Valley in California, very liberal area. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I said this very bluntly, right? And there was no depth. There was no, I didn't know much about either candidate. And I said very simply, if Hillary wins, I said McCain's probably going to win. He's probably going to have a shot. He's going to beat her. I said if Obama wins, there's no way in hell McCain's going to win, because there's with where we are right now, right? Everybody's going to vote for the young black guy versus the old white guy, right? And I had a lot of comments I got from a lot of my clients, and I said it just very bluntly. A lot of my and mind you, for most people, they still don't know, right? I'm Palestinian. My parents, I was born and raised here. My parents both immigrated here from the Middle East, right? So there was no race baiting or anything behind it whatsoever. I was just stating it as somebody who grew up in the heart of Silicon Valley and the culture I grew up in, as very matter of fact, which was like the young black guy is going to win over the old white guy. When we're talking about politics and where we were at that time, where everybody was like done with Bush, and and everything, like where the culture was going, where the narrative for the country was going, and that's when you first started really hearing about, because Facebook had started in 2005, about what we considered mainstream media versus alternative media, which is now, I think we shouldn't be calling it mainstream media anymore, right? Because these types of platform are getting more views and getting out to more people than doing, something on, say, like a CNN or an MSNBC or anything like that. So yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah.
No doubt. Yeah. Thanks for sharing your story there.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about a couple of different things with your past, as far as like kind of growing up and kind of led to where you're kind of going right now, right? So first of all, so you've talked about like, being a director on a couple companies and a startup. Where did the entrepreneurial mindset come from? Does that come from your upbringing, your family? Because to me, that's interesting to me. That's really interesting to me.
Yeah, I couldn't have spelled the word entrepreneur much less lived it out in undergraduate school. I was a college football player at Bowling Green, and my life was just totally consumed with Division I football and all that entails. So my mind just couldn't get itself outside of that box. Well, living a year in Houston and then getting married, moving to DC, something was sparked that I couldn't have called it entrepreneurialism, but it was the vision to start a new organization in Guatemala. And again, I didn't know that was what was entrepreneurial, but starting something is pretty entrepreneurial. So in the process of starting this organization and really loving the challenges and the opportunities that come with it because of the passion for vision and transformation, that's when I knew that I was not going to fit the typical 9-to-5 job in a place where I'm going to have a very clear job description. Like I was built for new, very gray areas of life where I could go in and tackle those problems with a clear vision in mind.
Yeah, one of my mentors actually calls that unemployable. And what he means by that is unemployable in the typical modern sense of the 9-to-5, punch in, go sit at your cubicle, punch, that kind of thing, and then just file reports all day long. Yeah. That's interesting. Speaking of which, like you talked about playing college football. You spent time playing for Urban Meyer.
I did. Yeah.
What was that like?
Yeah, it was intense. That's what everyone asked me to describe. I said intensity. That's the one word I will give you. It was my freshman year. I came on. It was his last season. He would coach 2 seasons at Bowling Green, and I was there his second year. And it was it was a hard slap in the face. He billed it a lot like basic training, and they wanted to break down the body to create mental toughness. And they were very successful at doing that. They broke down our bodies and broke us down as deep as we could mentally to make us tough and hard and calloused and reserved and ready to win ball games when it mattered. So it was a real challenging year. But looking back on it, there's a whole lot of leadership lessons that I've learned just from that 1 year of experience. I had 4 more years after that at Bowling Green because I redshirted, but I could see that he was going to be successful from the beginnings, the way that he led.
What position did you play?
Well, you can't tell now, and I won't dare ask your guest to guess, because when I ask people that, they say, "Oh, you must be like a cornerback." And one person said a kicker, and I was like, "Oh, that's the ultimate insight right there." I don't know what to do with that. I used to be an outside linebacker.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's
I
great,
like hitting
man.
people.
Yeah.
Between the lines and whistle to whistle.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, I would do wedge busting on kickoffs, and people ask me what you think about before you go on like break or have a huge collision with these massive dudes. And I said, well, you might not believe this, but I would have like tunes like Amazing Grace running through my head, or I'm running down the field and go and hit somebody as hard as I could. I don't know how it works, but it works for me.
Well, I think we're close to age. You were born in what, 82? You said
82. Yeah,
82. Right. Yeah. So I'm 79. So we're 3 years apart. But we're still. So we grew up in that age of like we were on the cusp of football where the word CTE and concussion didn't really. So concussions for us in high school and college was like unless you were knocked out, like you black out, right? There's no concussion, right? There's no brain.
Yeah, exactly.
So. Yeah, so the whole wedge buster thing is dude, that's interesting to me, man. That you played outside linebacker and you did the wedge busting on kickoffs. Man, that takes a whole lot of mental fortitude right there, especially in college.
Yeah, there were moments. I look back on the moments where I maybe didn't fully go through a hit, or I didn't execute the assignment. And it's amazing how college football has such vivid memories. Like I can picture those specific scenes. Like one game where at Wisconsin, and I'm running down, and I'm the L5 on kickoff, and I can see the lane that I have to my right where the guy was coming to block me. I could see the formation they were creating to take the runner outside. So I had a split decision to make. Either I'm going to go and follow the blocker where I think the play is going, or I can continue going to the guy that has the ball and is running. And I ended up deciding to make a move towards the blocker, thinking the play's going that way. Well, off of that one move, and I can still see this in my head, he makes a cutback, and the guy that was with me was an R5, the way they do it, L1, 2, 3, 4, 5, R5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So my R5 didn't see the same thing that I read, so he didn't come over. Otherwise, he would have filled that gap. The guy returns it back 91 yards to the 9-yard line because I made that split-second decision, and I can see that in my head today.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's the proverbial stay in your lane, like maintain your lane, right? So, yeah, it's funny, like some of the things that we remember as far as especially in sports, man. I played football. I coached high school football for a few years, and the one thing I love about it, and football does get a lot of flack right now, because of the backlash with head injuries and everything else as well. But I think it's one of those sports that's like the ultimate equalizer, right? Like what you mentioned there with like playing for Urban Meyer. There's a lot you take from it. There's a lot you take from it as far as, mental fortitude, toughness, being able to gut something. I think football out of all American sports is probably the closest we have to putting our youth through some type of basic training. And, maybe not now. I don't know. I'm more than 10 years removed from coaching football, and there's a lot of different regulations, kind of like how they're changing things and whatnot. But still, it's one of the toughest sports. Like willingly ramming your body into somebody else over and over again, right? And yeah,
I couldn't agree more. And I think as society tends to seek to demasculinate our men, our boys, football is a fantastic outlet because it's a legal outlet, and there are so many life lessons that you learn. And certainly understanding of the concussions and the concerns that surround that, and creating extra equipment, I'm all for that. But if you take away the game from kids who would otherwise be using that energy and passion and testosterone to do crazy bad things to society, that's a perfect outlet for helping these guys learn lessons that will turn them into men. It's a man-making sport.
Right. And just it's literally a sport where you have to put so much time and effort and energy into your own self-improvement as far as like technique. Like the one thing that surprised me, like when I started getting into coaching football was, in my first year, I was 24 years old, was the level of detail to technique. Like I never learned it in high school myself, right? And I went to just some like average public school, but I started coaching at a private Christian school down in California, and so they had better funding and coaching and film and whatnot as far as like how to break down game film, and that's so interesting where you watch something from afar and it looks like a bunch of guys running into each other, and then when you start getting into the nuances of it, as far as this guy had to learn that based off this guy's shoulder movement, he's going to take a step to the left instead of a step to the right, or he's going to do this over and over again. Or then you look at a playbook, like offensive linemen, some of the smartest guys out there, right? So because they have to know everybody's position, everybody's play, everything that's going on, and the level of intellect that goes into it. So you have to be disciplined for yourself, but like you just mentioned in that one play, if you don't do your job, then the rest of the team suffers.
Yeah, it's a game of split-second decisions. So everything you do must be done with confidence and must be done with pre-knowledge, kind of preparation in advance. That's why game film was so important as part of going from high school to college. Well, in addition to the rigorous training that changed, the biggest difference for me was also the amount of film that we would spend. We'd spend hours in the film room with our coaches, breaking down our practices, breaking down the games from the previous season, breaking down our opponents. We spent so much time going through every single individual play that I just didn't expect that. And like you said, it was because once you got to the moment of the game, you had to be instinctive. Like you couldn't think. You had to operate off of instincts. And those who would, if you waited a split second, you would lose out on the play.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you listen to anybody who plays on the professional level of like any sport, and the one thing they talk about is how much faster the game is from, from the collegiate level to the professional level. And then when they start getting really good at it, is they talk about everything slows down for them, right? They can act instinctually versus having to like think through everything. So, hey man, I could talk
Absolutely.
football forever. So,
So
actually,
could
I
I.
wanted to ask you about your company, SmartSolve. And just where did because here's the funny thing. My wife is from Santa Cruz, California,
Okay.
and so she's a self-proclaimed crunchy conservative. And what she means by so when you hear Republican and conservative, you think again, right? That message that was going around a lot was anti-environment, right?
Hmm.
And we're the polar opposite. And so
Yeah.
to see this company that that you have, SmartSoft, can you tell me about that and where that
Absolutely.
came
Yeah,
from?
I agree with you. I actually think that the best way for the environment and for the climate to be improved is through the private sector. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's through private sector innovation.
Hundred
Anytime you get
percent.
the government involved and you add regulation and you create rules and limitations and taxation and you penalize companies, you limit the ability of companies to innovate their way into technologies that will make a difference. And we've seen that throughout the course of society. I mean, you look at the Paris Climate Agreement. The United States is the only nation that met their commitments, even though we pulled out of it. And I
Yeah.
think it was right by President Trump to do so. We pull out of that
Mm-hmm.
that agreement, and here we are making our commitments. And it's because our private sector is creating innovation in those spaces that will help us move towards the future. So I have no question about that. And one second argument I'll make to that before I tell you about the company is if America begins to regulate technology and the Green New Deal and the $93 trillion that are in that deal, if that were to happen to our country, guess who's going to win? China.
Right.
China, India. They don't care about the environment. They're going to find the best way to sell a product to anybody that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
They have no care whatsoever about if we regulate an industry out of existence. They're going to find a way to use that industry to sell a lower cost product to the consumer. So those are two, I think, ironclad arguments that really motivate me to be engaged and be a champion for sustainability from the private sector vantage point. And that's what SmartSolve is. SmartSolve sells water-soluble paper. And amongst all the technologies that are out there in the packaging industry, there's a lot of flack that these big companies are getting because they have stuff that will never go away. And I remind people, well, one of the reasons why that stuff was created was to preserve food so that you could feed people that were hungry. So there's
Right.
some benefits to plastic packaging, but there are cases where we can make improvements. And that's where some things like innovations like water-soluble paper, which once it gets into water, it breaks apart, has a significant advantage because it's bio-based, it's compostable, it's all natural. So
Mm-hmm.
that technology and our growth as a company in that arena with things like water-soluble labels and water-soluble pouches and water-soluble board stock is something that's really fascinating and exciting. And I find myself in some really unique venues because of our strong stand on sustainability from the private sector vantage point.
That's amazing. I have to imagine that having a company like that, and then as you go through like you just said, some of the different venues you end up in, and some of the different people you're in, companies you network with, you probably find yourself in a lot of circles, whether it's like conventions or anything else too, like talking to different companies where their political leanings. Again, this goes back to my original thing, where they wouldn't see somebody like yourself, right, with your
Right.
political leanings and background, right, running a company like that, and then you come across people who have the total opposite. So that's got to give you some unique opportunities to talk to people and potentially dispel some myths about like what it is to be a quote unquote conservative Republican, like what people deem that and where they put you in that box of being like this is this nice little box of like you're a conservative like white male, so you're anti-environment, you're racist, you're this, you know what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think being in Seattle, San Francisco, Denver, we were supposed to be in Austin at a conference. I meet a lot of people like that.
Yeah.
And if they knew that I voted for President Trump in 2016, they might try to hang me. I
Yeah.
mean, it's they're that far on the political spectrum. So once they hear a little more about the story and the perspective, like we're actually for the same goal of
Right.
seeing a better environment. I just happen to believe that there is a better way of getting there, a better way, a faster way, in a way that causes less pain.
Yeah, like the mechanism of like how to get there rather than trying to dictate it towards people. It's like I compare it almost to and you would understand this being a parent, right? If like you order your kids to do every single thing this way and you know it's the best outcome and you know this is the best way and you know right to, well, you're not gonna, first of all, you're raising a robot, right? And there's no thought into it and there's no trial and error and there's no them learning how to succeed, how to fail, how to work through something, how to figure out a problem, whatnot. You can't just order your kids to do everything and control everything. And if you give them a little bit of that flexibility with some structure around it, so like you're saying, there needs to be some regulation, some types of structure to it itself, but there needs to be an open market. There needs to be a free market for companies. There needs to be something incentivized for them to do it, right?
Yeah, you can learn a lot as a parent. I've learned a lot of lessons from my kids, maybe more than they've learned from me.
Oh yeah, I'm still learning, man. So apparently I can't control everything. I don't know.
That is 100% the truth.
So with the company itself, how long have you had the company
now? So we started in 2016. I mentioned CMC Group. CMC Group has been around since 1980. So it's a business that's been established for over 40 years. And Al Caperna is the founder with his wife, Kathy, of CMC Group. And then as the company grew and progressed, they've created multiple business units or business divisions. Mm-hmm. And they started selling water-soluble labels, commercializing that technology for the first time in the world, in America, in the 1990s through a sister division we have called Daymark. And they sell these labels to the back end of restaurants for food rotation processes. So the leaders of the corporation said, man, we have a really unique material and we're killing it in the restaurant industry. Are there other industries out there that might be able to benefit from the value proposition of this unique material? So that after some time, they ended up commissioning a market research to be done and a business plan to be written. And I was the person they turned to. I had just been working with Al directly on a social enterprise to help create job opportunities for people in very poor areas of the world. And we basically failed at our ability to create a break-even scenario. So many issues with selling in East Africa that you would be bored to tears as I could tell you all the challenges we face with regulation and everything else. So I really felt like I was failing. And on the surface of the business plan, we were. But to the credit again of Al and the leaders of the company, they saw potential. And they felt like I could help them in a different way. So they commissioned me to write this business plan in 2015. And my recommendation was to launch a separate business unit that could commit itself wholly to the sale of the materials. And that was 2016. And we were profitable by year 2, and we continue to grow year on year. So it's been a really successful venture so far.
Isn't that amazing how just having like an outside perspective of something that already exists and bring somebody in, and 9 times out of 10, it's just like, how can we bring somebody in who has some fresh ideas, but at the same time also can just kind of simplify it for us, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we always do that. One of my favorite podcasts is Craig Rochelle. He's a pastor and runs this leadership podcast on a monthly basis. And I love his perspective. But he says he doesn't usually hire consultants because what he challenges his team to do is to step outside of your role, go up 40,000 feet, and then look in to your role and ask this simple question. What would somebody do if they took over my job today differently than the way I'm doing it today? What's one thing that they would change?
It's an interesting way of looking at it.
So I think if we can take ourselves out of our bias, the bias that we have and the things that we know, and run through thought exercises like that, they can prove to be tremendously helpful.
Oh, that's amazing, man. So that kind of gets me into, why we did this podcast to begin with, which is your book. So what motivated you to write this book?
Well, I was in worship service at my church here in Bowling Green, Dayspring, and I just felt like this conviction every time worship service would start for about a year that I needed to write a book. And I was like, are you kidding me? I can't write a book. I got 4 kids and there's just no way. So I kept on saying it over and over and over again until finally in 2018, I felt so convicted. There's this line that I've heard from a pastor that said, delayed obedience is disobedience. And I felt like I was delaying on bringing forth this talent that was being stirred inside of me, an assignment that I felt was being called upon me. So I decided to take action and made a New Year's resolution in 2018 that I would begin writing a book. I didn't commit to a book. I didn't commit to even 5 pages. I just said, begin writing a book. That was my weak commitment at that point in time, but it was what I had to offer. And I came across an interview. Somebody was reaching out to me as the chairman for the party, and they said, "Hey, you guys are a really unique county. Of 3,142 counties, you are one of 56 that is swing as having voted for Bush, Obama, Trump. And in fact, your county goes back a lot further than that. We go back all the way to the 1976 election before we quote unquote got it wrong. And then before that, it was like back at Teddy Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. So Wood County is this the word bellwether used in the political context represents a state usually that is the leading sheep of the flock. Where that sheep goes, that's where the rest of the sheep will go. So where that state votes or how that state votes is how the rest of the states will end up going. That's the direction of the nation. And within states, we have these political subdivisions or governmental subdivisions called counties in most places. And amongst those counties, there's only 56 that have that designation. So when they told me that, and I went through that interview and talked a little bit about what I thought made Wood County swing, I said, that's interesting. Like, there's something about that I think people might be interested in learning about. So that's what led to the start of writing Bellwether Blues.
Isn't that funny how sometimes when you decide no, I can't do that. I don't want to commit to that. I don't want to do this. I want to do that. Like you push away, the more kind of everything else kind of brings you to it. Even if you step away from it for a little bit and you circle back around to it like in a different fashion, right? And yeah. To me, that's always amazing because that's one of those things where, like you said earlier when we first started this podcast, is there's opportunities and then there's assignments. And like you felt like, okay, this was an assignment I needed to do. And the one thing you said right there when you were telling that story is you didn't commit to like, I'm writing a book, 5 pages, whatever it was. It's just like, I'm gonna write. And I think that's what screws up so many people, which is like that ability just to start. Right. Mm-hmm. Just to start, like just commit to start doing something because they get so caught up into that last end stages of how they're going to finish, what the project is going to look like and the whole thing. They're like forever a planner and never actually committing to doing anything.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm guessing you have a similar story with your podcast. But I think sometimes it's good to say no initially and then allow yourself a certain amount of no's. And if it keeps coming back to you, to your point, it starts to be confirmed as something that maybe you should start to pay attention to. I find my wife to be an amazing filter for the things I should say no to. So if it comes to the point where she's at finally saying yes, then there's something that I should really consider with that. And also agreeing with you, I can't think of the name of this book, but it talks about habits. And one of the most powerful way to establish good habits is starting very small. Like if you want to start working out, and Alex, you probably experienced this with some of the people that you train, the first thing you got to do is just get yourself to the gym. Even if you don't lift a weight, just get yourself to the gym, put on your shoes and go back home. And
show up
for 5 days straight. You're going to end up on a piece of equipment. You're going to end up on a treadmill. You might start lifting weights. Like that's how you start to cultivate the establishment of habits. And that's what happened with my book. And it was really 15 minutes a day. I just took 15 minutes out of my morning and started to write. And I said, I don't care what I write. I'm just going to write something. And over the course of time, I started to see this thing really start to flow into something that became very, very harmonic and powerful.
Yeah, you know what was motivating to me was like when I started this was I was teaching one of my kids, like it had something to do with it was my son. We were doing soldering, like we were just teaching him, and he just turned 11, and he was getting frustrated because like the dexterity in his hands and utilizing the tools and soldering around and everything else too, he was just getting frustrated with it. I said, dude, just don't worry about it. You're worrying about trying to build a car right now, like a remote control car. I just want you to solder this wire to this board. That's all I want you to do right now, and just kind of focus on that. And then he was like, oh, okay. And then, like a week later, he's showing me this project and then how, with digital camera, he made the stop motion like Lego movie and he taught himself how to do it. And then I realized, I'm like, there's something that happens when we get older. Like the more we grow up and the more responsibility we get, like, they always talk about it in movies, like you lose like that child, like, enthusiasm and that magic I think we're told no, or like, be realistic so much as you go through life, you end up like crushing that growth and entrepreneurial spirit. Right. And I think that everybody has it for the most part. It's just, you don't know how to bring that out as you get older because everything is so big. You just say, okay, I can't do that, or no, or someday, like that proverbial someday, like you're going to. So making it small and making it attainable and going after small achievable wins every single day are key to kind of achieving anything in life. And that, writing a book, if I say I'm going to write a book right now, just I can feel myself kind of getting, but 15 minutes a day, dude, that's easy. Anybody can do 15 minutes a day. Yeah.
Anybody can. And I proved it. I was not ready to write a book. And over the course of time, obviously, sometimes I would have days eventually once I got in the flow where I'd take a weekend out and maybe do a couple hours here and there. But
Mm-hmm.
it was really written 15 minutes a day. And there's a guy I interview in the book. His name's Guinness. He's a really well-known conservative author who's not from America. So he's likened to Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America in 1831. Maybe he wrote it later. He traveled to America in 1831. And that book has been a staple of understanding what America was like and what made it different from the rest of the nations that surrounded it. So he's been likened to Alexis de Tocqueville because his perspective, back to that outsider's perspective, is so refreshing. And he talked about this idea of a long road to freedom, a long march to freedom, and how you can't attain freedom in one generation. It's a multi-generational progression where we march in the same direction over a course of time. And if the right habits exist, specifically the habits of the heart, and this is where we get into the golden triangle of freedom, faith, freedom, family. If you have the habits of the heart, you will successfully achieve the destination after years and years and decades and generations and generations.
So what's the biggest thing you've learned so far from yourself coming out of like after you finish this book?
Ooh, that's a great question. What I learned about myself is I have one day you get so frustrated and stressed out about something that's not connecting. And sometimes sleeping on it can have the greatest level of awakening your mind or your thought process or seeing something differently you don't have. So if you're ever writing a book, and I hope you do someday, Alex, if you choose to write a book, just because you have writer's block one day doesn't mean you're going to have it on the next day.
Right.
So I learned a lot about the process of sitting on it for a day and coming back, and you'd have a fresh perspective that would allow you to get through it.
That's probably one of the hardest things that people have to understand. Again, going back to that thing I was talking about, is like when you get older and you have all these things, because like when you do, grow up and you whether you get married, you're not, and you have a career and you have children, all these responsibilities kind of come into your day-to-day activities, and you have all these tasks you have to complete on a daily basis. And you can get so caught up in that like you said, if you don't complete one or if you don't succeed at one right away, it's like this failure, and then you kind of hold on to it, or you complete it to the detriment of yourself and your family. And that was like one of the things I had to learn too, and getting back to what you said about listening to your wife. I just started this past year. We've been together, not married, but we've been together 17 years. And it's more like, okay, you know what? You have that outside perspective of not being me. And, when you cast doubt on something, I should probably kind of step back myself from being so decisively engaged in it and kind of heed what you're saying and say, okay, you have a different perspective on this. Like, I should listen to that.
So there's a proverb. It's one of my favorites. It says, there is wisdom in a multitude of counselors. So as individuals, it's critical that we have people that surround us, who care for us, who will speak truth to us. They'll tell us the things that we don't know or can't see. And if we don't have those people around us who can inform us of that, and this is why relationships are so critical. And, to really what I believe to be the key point of the book is, if conservatives are to be effective, it's because they'll have built long, enduring, lasting relationships, transformational relationships with millennials. And through the course of time, you will be able to convey the values and convictions that you hold true, because they will grow to trust you.
That's a really interesting point, because I was actually thinking about, like, when I was reading your book, and then I just started getting into more about looking at what's considered a millennial and Generation X and whatnot and all that. And then I was talking to my brother and my sister and my wife, and I thought millennial was, like, had just turned like 30, but then what society deems millennial was right on the cusp of 83, right? Something like that.
So there's a variety of definitions to millennial, but a majority of them actually start in 1980. 1980, 1981. What they say is, if you graduated high school before the year 2000, you're Gen X. If you graduated after, you fit the millennial description.
Gotcha.
Until those that were born in roughly 95 or 96, you had to be old enough to remember 9/11. So those are the two markers of the millennial generation. And
Gotcha.
you have a few that define it differently, but that's primarily how it's defined.
Yeah. So I was surprised to see, that broadly it was accepted that millennials were born in the early 80s, and for myself being 79, what was considered millennial, I was like, what? No, that's like right there. I'm November 79. So I'm like a month from, but so what do you see the differences? Like, there's this wide spectrum. I guess my question would be, like, how do you group a whole group of people, like you call millennials, right, that have this vast like age range and different backgrounds, and there's got to be some differences within that grouping and that that field of like those people, right?
Let me first answer that by going back to Guinness, who I talk about in the book. And he says, the thing about the generationalism is it was a creation of the 1930s and 40s by private sector companies trying to market their products and to create more revenue and to target a specific group. So he said he doesn't look at the world through generations as they're defined today. He looks at things through ages. While we do have nuanced differences for sure that we can highlight, every generation has had differences in the past with older generations that have existed. So there's nothing new about that. He argued that generally speaking, we are more alike than we are different. Having said that, I think you can narrow yourself down into modern studies that do demonstrate the nuanced differences that exist. And the reason Oz said what he said is basically the same tenets of faith, family, and freedom that influence the lives of older generations will also influence the younger generations if they're communicated effectively. Now, to your point, with specifically the millennial generation, Jason Dorsey with the Center of Generational Kinetics is somebody I cite in the book, and he identifies a split in the millennial generation between the young millennials and the older millennials. The younger millennials are those that were born roughly 1992, maybe 1990, somewhere about 1990 and after. And then the older millennials are those that are born before that time. And he said you can notice a difference. Winston Churchill has a famous quote that I cite that says that if you're not liberal at the age of 25, you have no heart. If you're not conservative by the age of 35, you have no brain. So what, isn't it interesting? And
yeah.
This is way back in 1940, when he's talking about these things. So what Dorsey taps into with that quote is he says he believes that millennials are following that natural evolution of thought. As you have family and you have kids, you get a job, you start to see things differently. You don't see the world necessarily through the lens of what your interest, the interest of yourself and what you can do, but you start to see the world through the lens of your kids. And longer term thinking and how you can make a world that will be successful and effective for future generations. And he said the older millennials have started to demonstrate the characteristics that are fitting of older generations. They've started to trend in that direction. Whereas the younger millennials really seem to represent a lot of the stereotypes that most people are aware of for the generation, the millennial generation.
I like how you laid that out, because for me, like as you were saying that, it struck a chord with something I actually told my son last year. And we were talking, I can't remember specifically what it was. And my son is 11. This is when he was 10 years old. But we were talking about, something, I was giving him a lesson on something that he was doing, just like a bad habit he had. And then he was asking me like why it was such a big deal. And I was trying to tell him, I said, look, my goal in this is I'm raising you, right, until, whatever it is. I mean, I'm always going to be your dad, but, my goal is to make you as much of a, functioning, member of society as possible that's going to contribute as much as possible as well, right? And then at the same time, with our core values that we want to instill. And I said, I look at it this way. I'm trying to take all the good things that my parents instilled in me and then improve on the things they didn't do well. And it's not a knock on my parents, but if you're not trying to, every generation, I guess you would say, to improve on some level, then as a human race, like what are we doing, right? Like why are we having children? Why are we what's the point of it if we're just like, and I guess this is what separates us from the average animal, right? Is like we do have like a cognitive thought and deep thinking, and we're trying to progressively get better. We're trying to get better generation. So I do see things from that level of at 40 years old. I see the benefits of like the way my parents and parents' generation thought and looked at things and some traditional values. But I also know that, I have 4 daughters, and I'm not going to treat my daughters the way my dad treated my older sister just because she was a girl. So, that's that level of improvement, right? And I think that's where you get that melding, like you were talking about, as far as the differences as millennials kind of get into that older one. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's something that I think the book talks about pretty deeply, and looking particularly at the millennial generation, because that's been the generation that is defined as making our nation the color blue, the blue representing the Democratic Party, and that the Republicans don't have a chance of winning that generation. So that's why I took a deep dive into that generation specifically and Wood County, once again, seems to prove to be a great county context for studying that, because we have a lot of millennials. We're a younger county. A lot of young families exist here. And I think as I've seen and heard the stories in the book, one story stands out right now, and that's of Tiffany Crane. Tiffany, her boyfriend wanted her to have an abortion. They were expecting a baby, ended up being twins, which she didn't know, but they were expecting a baby, and he wanted her to have an abortion. And she said, no, I can't do this. They ended up separating, and she ended up raising these kids. Well, her political thought before that moment was not really anything beyond who was the most likable candidate,
right?
Who was out there demonstrating media, who's everybody like. And then after she had these kids, she started thinking deeply about the issue of abortion, the issue of life, the issue of raising a family, and that's how her political leanings changed.
Yeah, it's amazing how your own experiences and circumstances can really start dictating and almost kind of bring to the forefront even things you don't want to even look at, or when you never looked at to begin with, and how you start, viewing the world and decisions you make, and both just like up close and then just like on a broader spectrum. I wanted to ask you, because you've had some time now between the completion of the book and it's getting ready to publish, it's coming out. When's it coming out?
So May 5th is the publication date. However, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all these places are kind of hedging a little bit on when they're going to release books, just based on the stay-home shutdown orders.
Right.
So we're trying to feel out when we're able to get adequate distribution of books out to all of those common stores. Regardless, on May 5th, people will be able to come to our website and order books. We'll have books in hand. I'm thankful we didn't run through any of the standard publishers like Amazon or others, because we have books being printed and they'll be available for sale. Yeah,
that's great. So the one thing I was going to ask you was, having the hindsight now of like the book completion and some of the stories you were telling and the arguments you were making at the end, as far as how to go about having a conversation with somebody, like the art of persuasion, basically. What's your thoughts now with what's just happened in our current political climate with the presidential race? I mean, we've got everything going on with like the COVID-19, the shutdown, everything else too. But step back from that. Okay, we have like, after everything that's happened, right? Democrats picked Joe Biden. Like that's the guy who's gonna. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it gives President Trump a greater probability of pulling off a victory. I think that if the Democrats had fielded another Barack Obama, it would have been a lot more challenging, because I think that there's a split in their party. And as much as the media and press tries to demonstrate these splits amongst conservatives and Republicans from the various worldviews that are held, there's a huge split that's happening, huge factionalization within their party. And you'll see a lot of the Bernie supporters, I think, sitting out because of their disagreement and distaste for the standard common Democrat politician. So I look at that, and I think that this COVID-19 is going to have some major implications on how people vote and what they think. That was not anticipated in my book, because it was written before the coronavirus hit. Having said that, the book really focuses on principles, and principles are timeless. Principles are going to go beyond one election. They're going to go through several elections, and the same principles that the party was built upon in 1854 are relevant today. And my argument to Republicans and conservatives out there is, if we abandon these principles today, if we forget about these principles, you can forget about the election victory you had 4 years ago, because in no time, the generations that follow will not have anything to anchor themselves to that they can identify with your party. So if you want lasting electoral success, you got to tie yourself to principles, not politicians, not personalities, not individuals. Find principles to hold on to, and they will carry you through.
Well, I think that's where individuals like yourself that are getting more and more involved and taking a more leadership role within the political parties, and the Republican Party specifically, are making that change. I spent a couple of years in the corporate world, and I worked for a multi-billion-dollar company, and I got a chance to sit down with a VP of their West Coast operations, and because I didn't grow up in a corporate environment, worked for myself for many years, and I asked him, I said, why are we doing this? How come we're not doing this? How come we're not do, like, you know, for a fact, like, this is better for people, this is better for relations. We have a union workforce and a non-union management. Like, why are we fighting with everybody? This is a super easy solution the way I see it. Okay. And what he told me was, Alex, listen, the one thing you have to understand is, yes, we're a multi-billion-dollar company. Yes, we've been around since 1907. I said, here's the problem. It's like a giant oak tree, and you're trying to make that oak tree move. And if you had, he said, all the flexibility and movement of like a bush that just got planted last week versus this oak that's there. When the wind blows, the oak doesn't just blow over. It doesn't. I mean, it takes a lot of force, a lot of time, and it takes movement. And he said that's kind of what it is. We're moving, and if you're looking at it up close, you can't really see it. He said, but we are. It takes a lot of power, a lot of inertia, and a lot of just, you know, individuals like yourself, and he's like myself, because he was 39 at the time, to kind of make this whole machine shift. Do you feel like with the Republican Party, especially now with the position you're in, that and I think they're starting to, but if they don't keep this groundswell of bringing in not just youth, because I think youth is ignorant to just say youth, but I'm talking about just the ideals and, like you said, principles of moving it into the right direction. Do you think it's going to take a big step back in the next election, or, you know, in the next, like, in the midterms or anything like that as well?
So I think right now Trump has gained an electoral majority that I think he'll hold on to. And if I were to look into the crystal ball and make a prediction, I really believe he wins 2020. And I think one of the reasons why he's been able to build that majority is the stories that I have in the book. The 7 stories really demonstrate to me what motivated people to support him. A lot of these stories, they didn't necessarily like his personality or the stories of his character. They really struggled with that. But at the end of the day, there were certain things that changed in their life that made them view that election differently with Clinton and Trump. And those things that, for all of the negatives and the challenges and the things that happen with the press and kind of the interactions between Trump and them, there are things that he has stood for and championed that these individuals will vote for him again. And that's why I think that he will win in 2020.
Yeah, as soon as Bernie dropped out, and you kind of saw it coming, especially with the way the electoral votes were going, and how it was this almost insurmountable, you know, move for him to make. But when he dropped out, and I said, okay, after all of that and all the hullabaloo and back and forth and over the last 4 years and tearing them apart, like, your best candidate is somebody who's deteriorating mentally, who's got God knows how many issues, right? I mean, we can spend a whole hours dealing on Joe Biden, right? But and again, for myself personally, this isn't a like Democrat Republican thing. This is just as far as like the best candidate, like that's who you're going to put up against Trump. He's going to wreck him. I mean, like, I mean, it's not even going to be close. And yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see, like, as far as you know, how things kind of move forward from that as well. But, you know, I wanted to kind of finish up with this. Is you were wrapping up your book with pointing out some things that were very specific with, like, things that the Republican and conservatives struggled with appealing to that millennial age, right, and that millennial group. And you talked about how. And you also mentioned it in the beginning when you, in the early part of your life, where when you were talking to certain individuals, like when you were in college, that what you were educated on and what you knew, like, you could speak no problem at all. You were an expert on that. But then you felt like in this other field, like you were getting just, okay, I had to step back and actually educate myself more on this, right? What's the biggest takeaway you've had from that, and how you feel moving forward for, I don't want to say just Republicans, but just that core American value of, like, that conservative value going forward, right?
Yeah, I'm going to tie it to your last question. And what can the party do to be effective? What can conservatives do to mobilize this oak tree? Because it's a great analogy. And it's hard. It's hard to shift a political party. And we are in a 2-party system. And 71% of millennials would prefer a third party. So a lot of millennials are really disillusioned. They're skeptical. They've moved away from trust in politicians and in parties. But we have a 2-party system on the basis of the way elections run, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So for the foreseeable future, it's going to be the Democrats and it's going to be the Republicans, which means for me to exert any bit of influence, I'm going to operate through the party that most aligns with the convictions and the truth that I believe and the truth that America was founded upon. And for the party to be effective, it must anchor itself in those truths. And that's my argument to conservatives is I'm not talking to the politician, the legislator, or the news commentator. I'm talking to Joe Republican in his lazy boy at home asking the question, how can I influence my grandkids? Mm-hmm. And the answer is to think deeper and to think smaller. Invest in their lives. Take them out to coffee. Invest in their dreams. Ask them what they care about. Listen to them. Build a relationship upon which you can have the currency of trust. And over time, when you know why you believe what you believe, which takes some studying, takes some research. I put some resources out there in the book for conservatives to understand more about the history of the Republican Party, the tenets that it stands for. Once you have those things in mind, you will be able to deliver a persuasive message that will awaken their soul.
I love that message, man. Jon, hey, man, thanks so much for taking the time to sit with this, podcast newbie. And
Alex, no, I appreciate it. I wish you all the best with this podcast. We'll promote it. And just the honor of being able to talk with you, and a budding, growing podcaster. I think that you're going to have great success.
Thank you, man. I really, really appreciate it, man. And thanks for putting up with some of the technical difficulties up front and, and all
man.
things podcasting.
It's all good. No problems at all.
Good, man. Hey, man, I wish you nothing but success with the book and your family and everything you guys are doing. And I look forward to talking to you again down the road.
Thanks, Alex. Likewise.
All right, Jon.
Looking forward.
Take care, bud.
Take care.